Hello, everyone. I'm Rivera's son, and this is Candlelight, Nonviolence in Dark Times. Today, I want to talk about toppling dictators or tyrants. We open this series with that beautiful Gandhi quote about, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. So let's talk about the fall and the ways that these regimes come toppling down. They always seem monolithic, impenetrable, invincible before they crumble. But we have seen all over the world that dictatorships always do collapse, sometimes of their own weight, and quite often because movements around the world have risen up to weaken them, to crumble their pillars of support, to erode their base of political support, and then in the last push of it, have forced them to leave power. This is true for not just dictators, but also for, s- social injustices or oppressive social conditions. Ursula K. Le Guin, the novelist, wrote about capitalism in this beautiful quote. And she said, "We live in capitalism and its power seems inescapable. But then, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, often in our art, the art of words." So when we think about this, think about all the things in the past that seemed invincible. Women being second-class inferior citizens, people of color being exploited, enslaved, and abused, the notion of settler colonialism, being able to just go places and take whatever land they wanted. There are child labor and child abuse used to be completely normal for human beings. So we know that things that were once assumed to be unshakable truths have indeed been shaken and rattled and crumbled and kicked out of the status quo for hopefully forever, and it's our job to make sure that is so. But there are also things today that we need to question our assumption of their invincibility. Certainly, the climate crisis is making us ponder the formerly unthinkable, that we may cause our own extinction, that we as a species may not be here to inhabit this beautiful, beloved earth of ours. We also have to question things that are very hard to think around. Capitalism, the oligarchy, the power of billionaires, which seems so huge and vast and looming and like it's on an ascendant curve into taking over our entire country. We need to start our resistance at that pivot point of denying them the satisfaction of that sense of invincibility. If the world can shift away from kings' divine right to rule to widespread democratic regimes in their place, then certainly we can question the ascendancy of the billionaires. We saw this in Iceland after the 2008 crash. Iceland didn't just say, "Oh, that's okay," to its bankers and to the politicians that enabled the bankers. They rose up and had a revolution against them and kicked them all out of power, rearranging their entire political system and refusing to pay back their debts. To the rest of the world, this was an unthinkable act. Of course, we must pay for the debts. Of course, we must bail out the banks, as the US did. They said, "We're not going to give you that satisfaction. No, we're not accepting these conditions. You do not have a divine right to rule, and we are going to take the ruling of our country back from you." So when we think about that today, That's the starting point of our resistance. We have to take back our minds, take back our sense of possibility and expectation. We can do this by understanding do the next step of this by understanding how all dictators topple. And to do this, we actually have to upend our sense of how power works. We think that powerful people are just magically powerful, that they say, go there, do that. Because they're so powerful, people go there and do that. Well, you have to turn that entire framework on its head. Powerful people are powerful because when they say, go there, do that, we obey them. We go there, we do that. Otherwise, a dictator is just a little man in a room having a temper tantrum. If nobody carries out his orders, the ditches don't get dug, the people don't get rounded up, the atrocities can't happen, and he's just shouting at the walls. So it's our cooperation and our compliance that gives people power, for better or for worse. And as we said in our last episode, this is why we need to learn where we can refuse to work for them, refuse to obey, refuse to carry out their orders. Dictators are held in place and given power by what we call the pillars of support. And these are like think of them like columns in the front of some of our federal buildings, or the White House holding up the ceiling, holding up the power. When we remove those pillars of support, when they stop working for the dictator, when the typists won't type out the orders, when the generals won't obey, when the workers won't go to work, when nobody will dig the ditches, that's when you shrink the tyrant's power down to just a little dictator having a temper tantrum in his own room. So our job is to find ways to remove those pillars of support, or if we can't remove them right away, to weaken, erode, and eventually crumble them. These pillars we can think of them as social groups. So things like faith leaders, lawyers in the legal community, politicians, students, NGOs and social organizations, businesses and banks. Each one of them is making choices day after day, whether to go along with the tyrant in the highest office in the land, or to say, no, no, your policies are abhorrent. Your behavior is odious. We will not just cooperate nicely with you. Each of these groups is offering a different kind of resource that a dictator is going to need. And this includes material resources, right? So things like even nuts and bolts, or tech support for the computers, paper for the printers. In 1920, when there was almost a coup in Germany, everybody stayed home from work. Nobody went into work for the potential coupists. They got into empty office buildings and they couldn't even type out their decree that they were now the ruling party because there were no typists in the building to type it. And then there were no copy machinists to make copies of this. And there were no um, people who would go make the announcements. And there were no radio announcers at work to say, and a coup has now taken over and they are ruling Germany. Within just a couple days, this entire coup attempt collapsed because they didn't have the infrastructure, the physical nuts and bolts to carry out their power. So how and where can we deny that to the abusers of power that we see today? Material resources also include things like money and economies. But nuts and bolts don't get up and walk places on their own. They always come along with a second type of resource, and this is human resources. Somebody has to pick up the bolts and carry them from point A to point B. If the dictator wants a ditch dug, somebody has to pick up the shovel and go and dig. Shovels don't just dig on their own. So the second kind of resource we want to deny to an abuser of power is the resource of our human labor. Like we were just talking about in Germany, people stayed home, said, no, I will not work for this. So the other really important resource is a funny one. It's authority. Every power holder needs to be granted the ability to rule, blessed by whatever form of authority there is in the world. My first election was in 2000 when the voters of this country didn't elect George W. Bush into office. No, it was too close. What actually got Bush into office was that first, the Supreme Court stopped the vote recount in Florida. That was the first awarding of authority to Bush that happened. Then the next one is the Democratic Party folded and said, okay, that's all right, great, we'll go along with it. We are sorry to have lost, but you know what, Bush, you're now in charge. So that was the second point of authority. The third one is the media, who then reported on this and didn't question the idea that, what? The Supreme Court just stopped the vote recount? Why didn't we finish that? And then the fourth form of authority was all of us as citizens, when we said, all right, I guess that's the way it's going to go. And we're just going to allow that to happen. These sources of authority can be revoked, repealed, rescinded at any time. And when someone is abusing their power with an authoritarian regime, it is our job and our duty to revoke that authority and to place it somewhere else where it is better suited. Along with the idea of authority comes the idea of sanctions. And this is the idea that if people don't do what the dictator wants, he can punish them, or she can punish them until they comply. And like with the nuts and bolts, this doesn't just happen on its own magically. People have to carry this out. So police have to go beat protesters to get them to stop demonstrating in the streets. Banks have to seize assets to intimidate people into stopping their resistance. Lawyers have to file lawsuits against politicians or citizens who are trying to oppose the abuses. If the police, the bankers, and the lawyers refuse to do those jobs for the dictator, he can't enforce his repression on anyone. So these are important groups to go talk to. Say, you know what, you have an option. You don't have to go crack heads with your billy clubs. You don't have to go fire tear gas. And indeed, when many dictatorships have fallen and toppled, this has been the case. The movements have risen up. They have filled the streets. People by the millions are out demonstrating. They're on strike from work, so nobody is working for the economy, and everything's on the verge of collapse. And what helps the movements keep going is the police stand back and they just do nothing. They may not agree with the protesters. In some cases, like in the Philippines, they even stayed in their barracks and did not come out to repress the protesters in part of that campaign. This is critically important because it can allow us to keep going more safely, more energetically. And getting these sources of repressive power to back off and not work for the regime can really change things. In Indonesia, when the Indonesians rose up against the Suharto regime, this was one of the big determining factors. When the students filled the streets with people, the military generals stayed home. So the next thing we need to think about in terms of the resources that prop up a regime and allow them to carry out their abusive, offensive, human rights violating orders and policies is that they are often supplied with knowledge from different groups and organizations and individuals that is absolutely necessary for them to inflict repression on other groups. Knowledge could be things like, where are all the Jews in Denmark when the Nazis wanted to round them up? Right? What are their addresses? What are their names? How do we get a hold of them? When this thing came into being, somebody blew the whistle on it. A Nazi in the occupation government told a Danish person, this is going to happen. They're going to round up the Jews. And that Danish person ran to the rabbis and said, hide everyone. And then thousands of Danish citizens did something truly remarkable. They hid Jews in their attics, in their basements, in their sheds. One doctor in a hospital checked thousands of Jewish people into the hospital under false names. They denied knowledge of the Jews' location to the Nazi regime. And in the end, the Danish people saved 7,000 people's lives. There are many ways that we can deny knowledge to the harmful regimes and individuals that we see today. And in so doing, weaken their ability and their power to occupy the halls of power. The last kind of source of support that all of our society either gives to a dictator or withdraws is this whole category of things that they just call intangible factors. They're hard to put your finger on, but these are things like the willingness of the people to resist, or our sense of obedience or disobedience. Are we the kind of society that kind of gets a kick out of a little mischievous rebellion? Or are we the kind of people who always like to play by the rules and are afraid to break the rules? Do we think it's hopeless to rise up? Or are we the kind of people who have this cynical daring do where we will rise up whether or not we think we're going to succeed, because that's what it means to be a human being faced with tough situations. These intangible factors are some of the most powerful factors in determining whether or not people will resist. So think deeply about what those look like in our scenario and set about with persistence and determination to transform them to the conditions and the factors that make people want to join movements and feel bold enough and brave enough and rebellious enough to do so. When you remove enough of these, when you deny material resources and human resources and sources of authority and knowledge and the ability to repress people, from a dictator, they suddenly don't have a leg to stand on, and they literally topple out of power. We have seen nonviolent actions stop coups and oust dictators. I've told you the long list of places from Bangladesh in 2024 and South Korea in 2024 to places in the 1920s and the 1940s, places like El Salvador or Cuba, Guatemala. We saw a whole rash of them in the 1980s and 90s, resisting the Soviet Union, from Czechoslovakia to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Serbia ousted a dictator. This list is long. It goes on and on because these tools are powerful. When we use civil disobedience, when we refuse to obey, when we don't comply with orders, when we do those marches and rallies, even when it's dangerous, when we use strikes and boycotts and general strikes and stay-at-homes and call-in sicks and sit-ins and shutdowns, this is where we take back the power. This is where we take back all those resources we just mentioned and put them underneath the movement to prop up our ability to self-rule and self-govern ourselves. This is what makes movements powerful. So this is the knowledge that has sparked dozens of nonviolent campaigns around the world to oust dictators. If you find it useful, insightful, maybe even sparks an idea for a resistance, don't keep it to yourself. Pass it on to someone, share it with your friends, because the more of us who can resist, the weaker the pillars of the dictatorship gets, the more the tyrant's position is unstable and unshaky, the more likely it is that the abusers of power will fall from power, allowing us a chance to build the world anew. Thank you all. This has been a great time hanging out with you on Candlelight, Nonviolence for Dark Times.